Something has changed about the FedEx Cup, and the most important part is that the change may not be visible on the leaderboard at all. As the 2026 PGA Tour postseason arrives, the players aren't simply entering another playoff, they're stepping into a system that has fundamentally changed what it means to become the FedEx Cup champion. The points have been reshaped, the starting advantage at East Lake is gone, and the work a player put in from January through the regular season now carries a very different weight when the final 3 weeks begin. But beneath those rule changes is a much bigger question, one that has divided two of the biggest names in professional golf. Scottie Scheffler and Rory McIlroy don't see the purpose of the FedEx Cup in exactly the same way. For Sheffler, the championship should ultimately be decided by what happens when the best players reach East Lake. If you're going to lift the trophy, you should have to earn it over 72 holes without a built-in head start. McIlroy sees another side of the equation. If a player spends months proving he is one of the best competitors on the planet, should all of that work really disappear once the final tournament begins? Do you agree with the new FedEx Cup format, or would you change something about it? And what's one golf topic you want us to cover next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're a true golf fan, make sure you subscribe. That tension sits at the center of the 2026 FedEx Cup redesign, because the PGA Tour is now attempting to solve two competing problems at once, rewarding players for what they accomplish throughout the season while also creating a final championship that feels like a true, fair golf tournament. Should the FedEx Cup honor nearly an entire season of dominance, or should everything ultimately come down to 4 days of pressure at East Lake? The answer won't come from another press conference or another rule announcement. It will come when the best players in the world finally have to play under the new system. The first thing to understand about the 2026 FedEx Cup is that the PGA Tour hasn't simply changed the final tournament, it has changed the balance of power across the entire postseason. The biggest adjustment comes down to points. Winning the FedEx St. Jude Championship or the BMW Championship now earns 750 FedEx Cup points, a dramatic reduction from the 2,000 points those playoff victories previously carried. That puts those wins on the same points level as a major championship or the players. The victory is still enormous, but it no longer has the power to completely rewrite the standings in a single week, and that is exactly what the Tour is trying to prevent. Under the previous structure, a player could arrive in August with an ordinary regular season, catch fire at the right moment, and collect a massive 2,000-point reward that could erase months of work by players who had been consistently performing. The new system makes that kind of post-season explosion much less powerful. A hot week still matters, but it can't completely overpower everything that came before it. Then comes the second major change. Starting strokes are gone at the Tour Championship. Under the previous format, players arrived at East Lake with different starting scores based on their FedEx Cup positions. The number one player could begin several strokes ahead of the field, while lower-ranked players started progressively closer to even par. That system has now disappeared. All 30 players who survived the first two playoff events will arrive at East Lake and begin the Tour Championship at even par. No mathematical head start, no handicap-style advantage, no player carrying extra strokes onto the leaderboard simply because of his regular season ranking. On paper, that makes the final event dramatically easier to understand, but getting to East Lake is still anything but easy. The postseason continues with the same brutal 70 to 50 to 30 progression. 70 players begin at the FedEx St. Jude Championship. Only the top 50 advance to the BMW Championship. Then only 30 survive to reach East Lake. Who do you think is under the most pressure in this year's FedEx Cup playoffs? And which player do you think has the best chance of winning it all? Let me know in the comments. And if you're following the biggest stories of golf, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. A player doesn't simply need to play well enough to make a cut. He needs to protect his position in the FedEx Cup standings because his ranking determines whether his season continues at all. And that is where the new architecture becomes especially important. By reducing the value of the first two playoff victories and removing starting strokes at East Lake, the PGA Tour is effectively placing more emphasis on what happened before the playoffs. The regular season now has greater power to shape the championship race, while the postseason is less capable of completely wiping that history away. But there's an obvious trade-off. The Tour may have made the championship cleaner and more competitive at East Lake, but it has also created a much more complicated question about what the FedEx Cup is actually supposed to reward. For the stars at the top of the FedEx Cup standings, the playoffs are about protecting an advantage. For the players near the bottom, they are about protecting an entire season. That difference is what makes the 2026 format so unforgiving. A player sitting comfortably inside the top 10 can look at the FedEx St. Jude Championship with a completely different mindset from someone hovering around positions 65 through 70. The elite players are thinking about positioning, momentum, and eventually reaching East Lake with a chance to win the championship. The players on the bubble are thinking about something much more immediate: survival. The 70-50 reduction means that 20 players will see their playoff run end after just 1 week. And with the first playoff victories now worth 750 points rather than 2,000, the mathematics of climbing the standings have changed as well. A single hot week can still transform a player's position, but the new system makes it much harder to rely on one explosive result to erase months of inconsistency. That's important because the players fighting around the cutoff don't have the luxury of simply hoping for a miracle. They need to make their opportunities count. A top 5 finish can provide a major boost, but with fewer points available than under the previous playoff structure, players cannot assume that one great performance will automatically carry them through the next stage. Every position matters, every birdie matters, and every missed opportunity can become the difference between playing the BMW Championship and watching the rest of the postseason from home. The pressure also extends far beyond the FedEx Cup trophy itself. Where a player finishes can influence his opportunities for the following season, including tournament exemptions, access to elite events, and the kind of schedule that can shape an entire career. For players outside the spotlight, this isn't simply a postseason competition. It can be a fight for professional security and momentum. That's what makes the bubble so compelling. The biggest names may be chasing the championship, but the players fighting to stay inside the top 50 are playing for something just as tangible: the right to keep their season alive. And while the stars can afford to think several weeks ahead, a player sitting near the cutoff has to think about the next shot, because under this new system, there may not be another opportunity. But for Scottie Scheffler, there is a much simpler way to look at the entire debate. If you want to become the FedEx Cup champion, you should have to win the championship on the golf course. That philosophy is at the heart of Scheffler's support for eliminating the starting strokes system. Under the previous format, players arrived at East Lake carrying different scores based on where they finished in the FedEx Cup standings. The higher the ranking, the greater the advantage. The number 1 seed could begin the Tour Championship several strokes ahead of players chasing him. Sheffler himself benefited from that system. He entered 3 consecutive Tour Championships as the number 1 seed and received the 2-stroke advantage at the beginning of each tournament. But despite having that benefit, Sheffler didn't believe the format was the best way to determine a season champion. He said he didn't love the previous starting strokes system and supported the direction the Tour was taking. And his reasoning is difficult to ignore. Imagine reaching the final tournament of the season and watching 2 different competitions unfold at the same time. One leaderboard showing who is actually shooting the lowest score, and another mathematical calculation determining who is leading the FedEx Cup. For traditionalists, that creates an uncomfortable situation. A player could technically shoot the best 72-hole score at East Lake, while another player wins the FedEx Cup because of the advantage carried into the tournament. Scheffler's preferred philosophy removes that complication. The regular season still matters. It determines who qualifies, who gets through the 70-50-30 progression, and ultimately who earns a place among the 30 players at East Lake. But once those players arrive, the argument is simple. Everyone gets the same starting line. No player begins with an artificial cushion. No one has to chase a predetermined number simply because another golfer accumulated more points months earlier. Everyone starts at even par. Then they play 72 holes, and whoever finishes with the lowest score wins the Tour Championship and the FedEx Cup. For Sheffler, that creates a cleaner definition of competition. The regular season earns you the opportunity to compete for the championship, but the final tournament determines who actually deserves to take it home. It is a pure meritocracy. But that very simplicity creates the problem Rory McIlroy sees from the other side. Because if the regular season earns you the room, but nothing more once you enter it, then what exactly is all that dominance worth when the final 4 days begin? But Rory McIlroy sees the same system from an entirely different angle. For McIlroy, the FedEx Cup is not supposed to be just another golf tournament. It is supposed to represent everything a player accomplished across an entire season. And if someone spends 8 months proving that he is the best player in the field, there should be some meaningful reward for that dominance when the final week arrives. That is where the even par reset becomes controversial. Under the new system, the player who finishes first in the FedEx Cup standings arrives at East Lake with exactly the same starting score as the player who barely survived the previous playoff round. Both begin at even par. Both have 72 holes ahead of them. And from that point forward, the regular season standings no longer provide a numerical advantage on the leaderboard. McIlroy has acknowledged that the old starting strokes system could be confusing and unpopular with fans, but he also understood what it was trying to accomplish. It was a way of protecting the marathon. The player who performed consistently from January through the regular season had earned more than simply an invitation to East Lake. He had earned a buffer, a tangible advantage that recognized the work required to finish at the top of the standings. Players dominated the FedEx Cup race for months, arriving at East Lake as the #1 seed and then struggling for one afternoon. Meanwhile, a player who barely made the top 30 catches fire over 72 holes and walks away with the championship. Under the new system, that outcome is completely possible, and that is where McIlroy's argument becomes more than a disagreement about starting strokes. If everyone begins East Lake at even par, is the FedEx Cup still a true season-long championship, or has it effectively become another 72-hole tournament with a prestigious title attached to it? The PGA Tour believes it has found a cleaner solution. McIlroy's concern is whether that simplicity comes at the cost of rewarding the players who earned the most over the longest stretch of the season. And that tension is exactly what the 2026 playoffs are about to put to the test. And now the debate leaves the world of theory and moves onto the golf course. The PGA Tour has tried to build a compromise. The first two playoff events carry less power than they once did, meaning a player can't simply explode onto the scene in August and erase months of regular season work. At the same time, the biggest financial rewards remain concentrated around the final stages of the postseason, keeping the pressure high as the field moves toward East Lake. On one side is Scottie Scheffler's vision. The regular season determines who earns a place at the table, but once the championship begins, every player should have the same opportunity to win it. No artificial head starts, no complicated mathematics, just 72 holes of golf with the lowest score taking the trophy. On the other side is Rory McIlroy's concern. If the FedEx Cup represents an entire season, then the player who spent months proving his consistency should receive something more than simply an invitation to the final tournament. If the new format produces a dramatic, easy-to-understand championship while still making the regular season genuinely meaningful, the PGA Tour may have found the balance it has been searching for. But what do you think? Should the FedEx Cup reward the player who dominates the entire season with some kind of advantage at East Lake? Or is everyone starting at even par the fairest way to crown a champion? And beyond the FedEx Cup, what's the biggest story or debate in golf right now that you want us to cover? Drop your take in the comments if you enjoyed this breakdown and want more coverage of the biggest PGA Tour stories, player debates, controversies, and changes shaping professional golf. Make sure you subscribe to the channel.